Hello, hello, welcome, please come in. Our fist weapon only runs have been completed, and it's time to go through the summary of how all those went. And those runs were pretty interesting. Fist weapons are not especially versatile, and there are shockingly few of them in each game. And fist weapons all share a few fundamental flaws. Their reach is bad, across the board. Claws in DS1 had slightly better range, simply by virtue of being claws cosplaying as fist weapons. But after that, hoo boy, are you stuck with the shortest range you have ever seen. This was varying levels of problem in each game, though which game has it the worst is obviously Elden Ring, but we'll get to some specific game talk later. Much like Bow Only, I really went into this series completely blind on what to expect. While I have played these games a lot of times, I don't think I've ever used a fist weapon in any game ever. I may have briefly used Iron Balls in Elden Ring once before, but I'm honestly not so sure. So, going in, I knew I'd need to sort out how to actually deal damage in this mess. But I could beat around the bush in this intro forever if I needed to, but I might as well get into the actual comparison portion of the video. And that, as ever, starts with a comparison of how difficult these challenges were. And we start that difficulty comparison with Dark Souls 1, and I think Dark Souls 1 should go into the middle position. Dark Souls 1 is always a question mark when I'm thinking about difficulty comparisons. DS1 is generally easier than the games that came after it, however it also usually has more limited options when trying to make a silly weapon work. And fist weapons are particularly trash here. You get the Kestis, which is fine, I guess. Okay, they're actually pretty awful, but they are the option, at least for a bit. Then you get the claws if you want to run all over the place, even more so in my case. These scale a bit better and have bleed buildup that can be okay against random mobs. Good news is that weapon buffs, like Resin and Magic Weapon, provide a static bonus to weapon damage. Combine that with Fist's reasonably quick attack speed, and you end up with a damage over time that is fine. Yeah, it still doesn't end up being particularly good. Dark Souls 1 also has a few bosses that are particularly scary for claws to deal with. Nido normally isn't too bad because you can permakill his skeletons, but wow does the Divine Kestis absolutely suck. Quelaag isn't too difficult to dodge, but oh boy do fist weapons deal absolutely awful damage. Even by fist weapon standards, the damage was just trash, which meant a very long fight, a very careful positioning. At least Quelaag has some very punishable attacks, which is good, because wow, it took a lot of time to get through. I can also mention the Iron Golem, though that was less fist weapons problems and more my need to be grabbed repeatedly for some reason. And of course the real problem children of the run, Orny and Smoo, who held the run hostage for a pretty decent chunk of time. This fight is just a mess to deal with when your damage is this awful, and the terrible reach doesn't help. This fight is already not a great fight, thanks FromSoft for another duo fight. Doesn't help that Orny's dash decides to misbehave half the time. However, DS1 can't really earn a harder position on this list, mostly because fist weapons, specifically the claws, actually manage to make short work of most other bosses that can be rough. The Four Kings DPS race was a one-shot, which was genuinely surprising. I didn't even need to use Power Within. Gwyn was very easy because I actually remembered how to parry. Centipede tried to misbehave but didn't really do anything that threatening. So while fist weapons are not good in DS1, the game is broadly easy enough that DS1 can't snag the first position, despite many nonsense attempts at doing so. And of course, up next is Dark Souls 3, which seems to always be either the hardest or easiest of the games in this series. And given prior performance of paired weapons in DS3, you may be unsurprised to learn that DS3 will be getting the last place award in this series. And it shouldn't really be that surprising. Despite there being more weapons in DS3, the number of fist weapons is actually about the same, mostly because claws have been carved off into their own category. And just like DS1, that came down to the starting Kestis, which served its purpose quite well. It's also nice that you can just infuse weapons early on to fully remove scaling. This meant I could focus all my levels into Vigor really early on. I'm usually forced to choose between damage and survivability, and by that I mean I will always abandon survivability for big damage numbers, because it's less a choice and more a compulsion. I got to the Vigor soft cap of 27 shockingly early in the game. And yeah, that extra durability is indeed great. Something about having 1000 HP before, well, the end of the game is indeed neat. And having that nice fire infusion mixed with the strength of paired weapons in DS3 made a lot of the early game pretty easy. And then I got the Demon Fist, which basically carried me through the rest of the game. I did set myself up to use Magic Weapon, but I really shouldn't have bothered. You can't buff Demon Fist, and even buffed, Kestis would not have been able to compete. And DS3 earns the bottom position mostly because none of the bosses really made me struggle. Don't get me wrong, some of the more difficult bosses did require multiple attempts, but that was more out of sloppy play rather than actual difficulty. Seriously, look at that speed and damage. Dragon Slayer was easy, Twin Princes only took a handful of attempts, and that came down more to my refusal to dodge the most telegraphed attack in FromSoft history over and over and over again. Something about Flaming Fist just destroys bosses, it turns out. And that reliance on fire damage could have been a roadblock in other Dark Souls games, but good thing there are very few bosses that care about fire damage in this game. And Yorm is the only one that's required, and for that I have Onion Friend. So, as usual, DS3 earns the bottom spot in difficulty because paired weapons are really good. And that brings us to Elden Ring, which gets to earn the top spot in difficulty. It is kind of close with Dark Souls 1, both games were mostly pretty easy until they very much weren't, but Elden Ring gets to earn the top spot in difficulty because of how difficult it got. Dark Souls 1 really only had Ornn and Smoo, maybe Nito a bit, and even bosses I expected to give me issues, like the Four Kings, ended up being a one-and-done situation. Elden Ring had no such issues. It's also funny because for most of the run, Elden Ring was actually the easiest. The Spiked Kestis isn't exciting, but it deals okay damage and has bleed buildup, and as soon as I got the Iron Balls, which I could have actually done right at the start of the game, bosses were just crumbling. Seriously, that charged R2 attack is hilarious. Why does it deal that much damage? Why does it deal that much poise damage? For the first half of the game, basically every boss I ran into fell very quickly and very easily to the might of twin-fisted balls. And things were going very nice, very breezy, and then came the problem children, the bosses that, by themselves, cemented this game as top in the difficulty ranking. It started with Fire Giant. This fight is pretty miserable on a good day, and the first half of the fight was also pretty easy. Breaking his ankle, it turns out, is not difficult with charged attacks. But Phase 2 is the problem. Heavily reduced damage unless you hit his hand, I think. In the limited time you actually can do so. He also doubles down on nonsense fire attacks that are just upsetting. Fire Giant wasn't the hardest fight in the run, but it is definitely my least favorite. And then comes the run killer himself, Malekith. God, the Malekith fight sucks. Black Blade effect is just awful to deal with. Malekith put Elden Ring in the top slot in difficulty by himself. I went on a 2-hour side quest just to get runes to level up, taking me across the whole of Elden Ring, and I came back and I still died on my first attempt. 30 levels later. I did, obviously, manage to win the fight eventually, but good lord, Malekith is so difficult. At some point I need to set up a cheat engine table to just practice this bastard's nonsense. 'Cause oof. And then we arrive at the coveted and competitive recommendations section. And we start with DS1, and DS1 gets to be slotted into last place. This isn't super surprising. The run wasn't bad by any stretch, but it definitely earns that last place ranking. The first issue is that fist weapons aren't very fun to use. I mean, they aren't awful, but when you compare them to the fun they will become in DS3 and Elden Ring, they feel stilted, kind of awkward, with limited reach and worse damage. Which, to be fair, a lot of those complaints can be leveled at Dark Souls as a whole, but I don't grade on a curve and will not be starting now. Dark Souls just doesn't have anything to save it from the jank. The limited weapon pool is pretty similar and functionally amounts to how you want your damage to scale, mixed with the Kestis, dexterity with the claws, or badly with the Dragon Fist. Combine that with the no quality of life features introduced in later games, some truly obnoxious runbacks that, to be fair, I did mostly sidestep, and a lot of meh bosses, and you end up with a game that starts in last place just by virtue of how the game plays in general, and you end up with a pretty low recommendation. I do love Dark Souls, but Dark Souls 1 came out 15 years ago, and even the remaster is 8 years old at this point, and you can feel that age while playing it. And while there are a lot of really fun runs you can do in Dark Souls 1, fist weapons feel particularly underbaked in this game, and so this game does have to earn last place. And then comes Dark Souls 3. Still not a new game by any stretch, but one that feels way better to play, and I think this is going to earn the top slot in the recommendation. Fist weapons are really fun in this game. You are still pretty limited in what weapons you have access to, it's basically the Kestis and the Demon Fist, which isn't a great selection. On the other hand, the Kestis can be infused, and the Demon Fist is just a treat. The game has also really fleshed out the moveset and made fist weapons paired weapons, which makes the fist way more usable. You could also get claws going if you want to be a bit more lenient in your rule set, and that adds a handful more options. Are claws good in DS3? No idea, have fun finding out, but DS3 has all the things I like about DS1 and just improves them, for the most part. One knock against the game is that you do have to get a little bit further into it to actually get 2 fist weapons. The first fist you can get requires beating 2 bosses and running a decent way into the next area, which is inconvenient, but not a deal breaker. And then things get fun. Fist weapons are really fun in DS3. This game earned last place in the difficulty ranking, but that's mostly because there were no big roadblock bosses. No Orney and Smoo, no Malekith, just a lot of relatively fun boss fights that fists were pretty good against. Dark Souls 1 had 1, maybe 2 bosses that were legitimately difficult, and then a lot of boring, easy slop to get through. Elden Ring, which I'll talk about more in a minute, has a handful of really difficult bosses and then a lot of punchable idiots, which is basically why DS3 gets the top slot. It managed to maintain fun difficulty consistently, without the highs that made me want to throw a controller, and the lows of I may fall asleep because this boss is too much help. And that level of consistency across the run does so much to earn the top slot. It's way easier to recommend a run when I don't have to add a huge caveat to it. And then we get to Elden Ring, which gets to be placed in second. The first issue, which is always an issue, is the open world nature of Elden Ring. You have access to so much right out the gate. This means a lot of variety, a lot of weapon access right at the start of the game. It also means the first hour of any playthrough is just running around on Torrent picking up random items. And then you can start the run, but these running sections will continue to lesser degrees throughout the entire game. I've honestly considered doing runs in this game region locked, not because I think that will be more fun or even that much more difficult, but because it will mean I can spread out item acquisition more evenly. But that is an issue that Elden Ring always has on replays. The real problem with this game is how inconsistent this run is. Iron balls are very strong. They deal way too much damage, way too much poise damage, and they can invalidate over half the required bosses in this game. I mean, look at this. Why is it like this? You even get the Star Fist, which is just a flat upgrade that I forgot about until way later than I should have. Radagon, normally a decent challenge in these runs, got off 2 attacks. 2. And the Elden Beast barely fared any better. Seriously, most of these bosses were so easy, except some bosses were not. I already discussed who and why in the difficulty section above, but that inconsistency, swinging from so easy it's kind of a little bit boring to so difficult I wish to not do this, means a really weird run. The difficulty curve of fist weapons in this game is just a mess, and it becomes really difficult to recommend a run when it swings from wild ROM to slamming my head through a wall difficult. It is still mostly fun, but that wild swerve in difficulty and the amount of running around picking up random items means I just can't justify putting this in the top slot. Oh well, maybe next time. And that was Dark Souls, fist weapons only, and that was inexperience. That was mostly positive. I've never really used fist weapons in any of these games, and other than already knowing that Iron Balls and Starfist were busted in Elden Ring, I didn't really know how this would pan out. So it was fun to do a few runs to see how Dark Souls treats fist weapons, and the answer is inconsistently. I did want to shout out that I do have a Patreon, linked in the description. I spend a lot of time making these videos, so if you enjoyed the video, want to support the channel, and are financially stable enough to do so, that exists. No pressure though, this channel is free to enjoy for everyone, and will remain that way. For now, if you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more of this, feel free to subscribe. Hey, maybe leave a comment if you have something you'd like to say. But whatever you decide to do, have a safe trip home.